Luma and the Flight with Pelicans. Luma woke to a silver hush that smelled of salt and the quiet edge of morning, and she knew even before her eyes opened that the sea was near and that the pelicans were gliding beyond the dunes. Her fur, a calm sweep of silver and blue, held the last cool of night, and the small light at the tip of her tail rested like a patient ember. In the distance, waves breathed against the long shore, steady and forgiving, and a low current of air moved over the grasses so softly that each blade seemed to listen before it leaned. She rose and followed the scent of tide and kelp and wet stone across the sleeping sand. Beyond the dune crest the beach opened wide, pale as a memory of sunlight, and there upon the slow wind a line of pelicans moved as one, wing-tips near the surface, beaks patient, eyes bright with quiet work. Luma stood and watched their unhurried rhythm, how they lifted and settled and lifted again, how the ocean laid out a path and the wind stitched it to the air. She felt a tug in her chest that was not hunger and not sorrow but the kind of wish that arrives only when the world is peaceful enough to hold it. She wished to learn how it felt to move with a current that asked for almost no effort, to trust the shape of air, to become a small piece of a larger calm. A single pelican turned and passed above her where the breeze crossed the dune grass. "I see you, little wanderer," said the look in his patient brown eye, "and you may come with us if you promise to listen more than you speak." Luma dipped her head. The pelican lowered to the shore and folded his wings and stood beside her like a pillar that had learned to breathe. He said that the flock would lift with the warming light and that if she wished to come, she should climb upon his back and rest along the line of feathers where the wind would hold her safe. Luma placed her paws with care, felt the warmth of a strong living frame beneath her, and settled to the curve that ran from shoulder to wing. The pelican stepped to the water where a thin line of foam drew lace upon the sand, and then he opened himself to the wind and rose. The others followed, a string of quiet vessels taking the light, and together they turned along the coast toward a chain of low islands as pale as shells. The first breath of flight surprised her not with speed but with stillness. It was like becoming lighter rather than moving faster. The air cradled them and the line of birds rode its unseen river. Wing beat, then glide, then another long glide where even the sound of feathers seemed to soften. Luma kept her body level and let her own small glow tuck down so it would not trouble the natural blue of the morning. Below them the water showed its many voices, ribbons of darker swells, pale laps over sandbars, green windows where seagrass combed the tide. A school of fish turned in a single mind and the surface dappled like a sheet sprinkled with coins. A broad ray wrote a slow sentence through a shallow cove and erased it with the next turn. The pelican beneath her breathed like a bellows patiently working, and every time he took a longer glide she felt him give some part of his weight to the air, and the air accepted without complaint. They followed the faint rise of warm currents that lifted off the dunes and the low cliffs. When a swell of air turned upward the birds leaned and circled, climbing without strain in wide quiet spirals. Luma looked sideways and saw the line of wings turning together like the pages of a large book turning in a kind hand. The sea winked, the beach flowed backward, the islands drifted closer. A headland appeared that smelled of sage and stone and salt. Beyond it a lagoon opened in the shape of a crescent and a river joined it with a silver tongue. Pelicans dropped into a lower path and skimmed so near the surface that their wingtips almost touched, then rose together to clear a bright scatter of floating kelp. Luma felt the curve of the world under them, and for a breath she forgot land and sea and only knew the mild patience of air. They came upon the first island. It wore a ring of pale sand and a crown of scrub and low pines that leaned inland. On the inner shore a raft of sea lions rested like smooth boulders that knew how to sigh. The flock glided past and the sea lions lifted their heads and made a sound that belonged to their bodies and then relaxed again. Farther along the sand held the footprints of night wanderers and the delicate hieroglyphs of tiny shore birds. Luma watched a heron plant its long legs in a rivulet and consider the water until it shaped the exact stillness that fish find most comforting, and in that comfort the fish rose and the heron took what the morning had offered. Nothing hurried, nothing pushed, and yet everything moved. The pelican told her that this was the way of a day that understands itself. Clouds arranged themselves in low soft acres and laid shade upon the water in drifting fields. The flock climbed the edge of one field of shade and entered a hallway of brighter air, and Luma felt the temperature change along her whiskers. A faint scent of distant rain arrived and then faded. They passed a barn at the far rim of pasture where a farmer led a pair of small horses and laughed at something gentle. They passed a village where windows stood open to let the morning in and a cat walked a wall with a careful tail. Everywhere the world was doing exactly what it always did, but this time Luma stood inside its easy rhythm rather than watching from a doorway. She thought that the morning had created this still game just for the birds and also for her. Then she thought better and understood that the morning made this game for itself every day and that the gift was to be invited to play. As they flew, the pelican hummed in a voice more feeling than sound. He told her that the flock would show her the long lines where wind and water speak to each other and the quiet pools where the tide rests and the climbing rooms of warm air over the cliffs. She would learn how to glide along a line until it ended and then to accept its ending the way a reader accepts a last page before finding a new story a few pages later. She would learn how to turn without thought when the lead bird signaled, and how to lower to water without splash when the time came to find a pause. Above all, she would learn to let the world carry more than her own muscles did. She agreed by lowering her head and making her body a little smaller so the air could smooth around them. They reached a second island with dark rock faces and a cave mouth that breathed. The flock turned in and the cave welcomed them with cooler air and a hollow tone like a long-held chord. On the inner wall the rock was wet and reflected their moving forms as if the cave were a quiet memory remembering them even as it met them. A school of silvery fish leapt in the entrance where light met shadow and splashed again like small tinkling bells. Luma looked up and saw a crack of sky in the high ceiling where ferns grew from stone and a trickle fell in bright beads. The pelicans wheeled once inside the open chamber and then slid back out in a line that stitched the mouth of the cave to the day. When the sun rose higher, the wind shaped a slow river along the outer bar and the flock entered it. Now they scarcely moved their wings. They took the gift given and made no noise about it. Luma let her thoughts match that quiet. She remembered a meadow she had crossed long ago and understood that gliding is to air what coasting is to water and what resting is to a tired mind. A small gull flew near and looked at her with lively curiosity, then went on to other work. A seal surfaced with a round, kind face and then slipped away with barely a crease upon the sea. The world continued to offer moment after moment, and none of them demanded a strong opinion. It was enough to notice and to move with care. Near midday they came to a far island where white sand curved like a smile. Inland a shallow lake lay bright as a polished shell, and at its edge stood a grove of trees that leaned over the water and planted their reflections upon it, as if planting saplings. The flock circled and lowered and glided to a landing along a quiet spit of sand. Luma stepped down from her friend and shook out her legs and felt the ground accept her a little at a time, as if welcoming her home from a soft long swim. The pelicans folded their wings and settled in pairs with the look of sailors who know how to enjoy a still harbor. The air smelled of salt and resin and sun-warmed rope. Luma walked to the lake and saw a narrow causeway of stones crossing it like a delicate bridge just below the surface. The water slipped over the stones and made a sound like gentle talking that could be ignored or listened to and would take no offense either way. A great white bird stood at the far side of the lake, tall and straight, an egret whose neck seemed to be made of patience. She glanced at Luma and then returned her attention to the shallows where minnows wrote silver marks. Across the grove a breeze arrived and leaves turned their pale sides to it and then their deep sides again. Pelicans preened, bathing their beaks and shaking small drops across the sand. Luma rested and let the place pour its calm into her. When she closed her eyes, she felt as if she was still gliding, for the body remembers and continues and only slowly agrees to stop. After a time, the lead pelican raised his head and the flock rose without fuss, and Luma climbed upon her friend and they went on. Afternoon brought a taller swell and longer lines of traveling foam. Far offshore a pod of dolphins moved, surfacing in easy rhythm, and one turned on its side so that its eye met the flock the way two travelers might greet each other from neighboring roads. A dark fin cut the water behind them and then sank, and everything went on being itself. They flew past a cliff where swallows nested in little holes and stitched the air with quick needlework. At the cliff top sat a light tower with red railing, and beside it a person waved and then returned to their book. Luma looked ahead and saw the horizon bending slightly like a smile that had all the time in the world. The sky began to soften toward evening, and the birds found a long living stare of warm air that rose inland from a broad valley. They climbed almost without moving and then floated level along the high edge of day. Luma felt the cool along her paws and the warm along her back, and she thought that this is what it means to be held without being kept. She thought that trust is a kind of flight you do inside your body, and that the air understands it first and teaches the rest of you. Below them a river unwound and turned and unwound again, a sleeping serpent of brightness. Geese drew a letter across a field. Boats returned to harbors where ropes and cleats waited like handshakes. The flock turned back toward the first shore they had left in the morning, and the sea welcomed them with its long voice. Evening light laid gold on the backs of waves and put gentle fire along the edges of the birds. Pelicans skated the last mile as if they were oil upon a brush. The lead bird tipped a wing and the line settled down to the water and then to the sand above the tide line. Luma slid to the ground and stood for a moment between water and land while her body learned gravity again. The pelican who had carried her looked at her with that same patient eye, and she understood that he did not measure the day by distance but by ease. She lowered her head in thanks. He answered with the simple lift of a wing and a soft blink, and then he turned to the work of evening. The flock preened and stretched and made small sounds of comfort. The sky deepened and a first scatter of lights on the land side came on, little villages of warmth in windows. A child on the dune waved and Luma waved back with her tail glow, and the child laughed and ran to tell someone about the fox who waved. She walked along the shore while the tide reached and retreated, and she let the day unwind inside her. In her chest there remained the line of air that had carried them and the feeling of wings in a wide room. She knew she had not earned the flight and had not been tested to be worthy of it. She had only been invited and had listened. She thought of the way the pelicans accepted the end of one current and found the next without complaint, how they did not argue with the wind but read it and answered in its language. She promised to carry that lesson into other days, to look for the soft path rather than the hard one when soft would do, to notice where a current already existed and to join it kindly. She drank from a pool left by a wave and tasted clear cool and a little depth of the world. Then she found a place where dune grass would shelter her and lay down where the sand was still warm. Night gathered in quiet layers. Far out over the water a dark shape moved, then another, and she understood that even now the birds managed the sky with wings folded and opened in a measured dance. The sea kept its slow counting, the beach exhaled, the dunes leaned together like listeners who had heard a good story and wanted to keep it. Luma closed her eyes. The memory of gliding returned, not as motion but as rest. She felt herself supported by something larger than she was and she trusted it. If a thought rose, it rose lightly and then settled again as a feather settles. The sand accepted her shape and then forgot it. The air moved over her fur with the care of an old friend. Sleep came without needing to be called, as if it had been flying with her all day and had only now reached the same landing place. "Listen," said the shore without words. "You may let go of the white noise that stands behind your day. You may set down the weight you carried at noon. You may allow the body to choose the easy angle. You may feel how the ground gives back a little of what you give it. Breathe," said the tide, and it offered an example, in and out, not fast and not slow, a simple rhythm that a small boat might admire. "Rest," said the open sky, and it drew a sheet of quiet across the dune and tucked the corners with a wind soft as a hand smoothing a blanket over a sleeping friend. Luma let each suggestion sink through fur and skin and muscle and bone until even her thoughts felt like shells that the water had rounded. She listened to the faint click of sand as the day cooled and to the distant call of a night bird who wanted company not for talk, but for shared silence. The world arranged itself into wider circles that overlapped and understood each other, wave meeting wind, wind meeting feather, feather meeting trust. She dreamed already, and in the dream she flew again, but now she needed no back to carry her, for the dream gave her its own buoyant room, and even then she did not race. She kept the kindness of the day close and let the dream choose a very long glide. In that glide she passed over 1,000 small homes, and each one had a lamp in a window that said all is well enough for now, and over 1,000 night fields where the soil stored the cool for tomorrow, and over coves where the sea held secrets that were not dangerous, only gentle and private. She felt gratitude and let it be simple, like the way a pelican folds its wings and stands looking toward a horizon it does not plan to consume. When morning planned its return somewhere beyond the curve of the water, Luma turned once in her sleep and then settled again. She would wake when the light asked politely. She would rise, and maybe the pelicans would be there once more, and maybe they would not, and both were fine. She had been given a shape of moving and a shape of resting, and both fit her now. In that knowledge she allowed the night to become deeper, then softer, then deeper still. Her breath matched the shore, and when the shore paused so did she, and when the shore resumed she followed. Everything agreed to wait until she was ready. The dunes listened, and the sea wrote a small poem and erased it and wrote it again and did not mind repeating itself, because goodness often likes to repeat itself. A gull cried once and then remembered it could be quiet. The fox slept and the flock slept, and even the wind slept a little while it drifted across the sand and forgot to be a wind at all.